Hi everyone, welcome. Thank you very much for joining us for this webinar today and for the launch of the guidance that we've put together. If for those who don't know me, I'm Bethan Evans. I'm a Professor of Human Geography at the University of Liverpool and Director of the Centre for Health, Arts, Society and Environment at University of Liverpool as well. I've been very lucky to work over the last couple of years with Anna Ruddock and Alison Allam on the research that's informed the guidance that we're launching today, and also over the last year or so with Catherine Hale, who's helped us with pulling this guidance together. So the research was funded by a Independent Social Research Foundation Political Economy Fellowship. And we've also had some additional funding from Research England, AHRC and ESRC Impact Acceleration Awards. We want to start with a really huge thank you to the over 240 people who contributed to our research via completing surveys, interviews, or focus groups. All of those people have precious energy and huge workload. So we really appreciate the time that everyone spent with us. So before we go any further, just a few housekeeping notices. So first, captions are enabled, so you should be able to turn them on using the button with CC on it. We're recording the webinar and we'll be making it available on our website if the tech behaves. So if you don't have the energy to stay for the full hour, we will have a recording available. Because of the number of people that are here today, we've set this meeting up as a webinar rather than a meeting. So that means that you won't be able to turn your microphone or camera on, but you can ask questions using the Q&A box. And there's an option to upvote questions that other people have put in that box. So if you have a similar question to one that other people have asked, please use the upvote function rather than duplicating the question. Poppy Budworth has kindly agreed to monitor the Q&A box for us today. We also have a Padlet, the link to which Poppy has put in the chat. Please do follow that link and use the Padlet to post any feedback or reflections after the webinar today. If you have questions during the webinar, please put them in the Q&A box. The Padlet will then remain open for the next couple of weeks if you want to take some time to look at the guidance and reflect on anything, and we'll share it via email at the end as well. So we intend this webinar and the Padlet to be an inclusive space for all people. So please do keep comments and questions kind, free from bullying, harassment or offensive comments. As with any online event, there is a risk of trolls and we will remove them as soon as possible, and also anyone making any offensive comments. Okay, so housekeeping over. What we're here for today is to launch two documents which offer guidance for making academia a more inclusive space for people with energy limiting conditions. One specifically for funders and one that covers guidance for employers, union and EDI leads, publishers, conference organisers and academics with energy limiting conditions themselves. Before we go any further, for anyone who isn't familiar with the term energy limiting conditions, I'm going to hand over to Catherine Hale, whose groundbreaking work originated that term, so she can give you some background. Thank you, Catherine.
Thank you, Bethan. It's great to be with so many people here today. So energy limiting condition, or ELC, is an umbrella term for conditions where fatigue is prevalent and debilitating. This term and the related concept of energy impairment comes from the Chronic Illness Inclusion Project, an emancipatory research project that explored chronic illness through a disability rights lens. Anna Ruddock and I, with Anna Bay, have just published an article describing how participants called for new impairment concepts to better reflect their disability identity and enable more effective self-advocacy. They especially wanted to reframe the concept of fatigue, which they said trivializes and even invalidates the experience of chronic illness. What's important is that energy impairment doesn't just affect one type of function like vision or mobility, but limits almost all functions and activities. We know this impairment experience is common at a population level because government surveys show that 1 in 3 disabled people report impairment of stamina, breathing, or fatigue, a closely related term. Within the higher education sector, while we don't have data on ELCs, we know that at least 22% of disabled academics have a long-term illness. Next slide, please, Bethan. We can't say precisely who's included under this umbrella because it's about how an individual is affected by their condition rather than what causes it. ELC is commonly used by people with ME, long COVID, and similar illnesses where exertion intolerance is the hallmark feature. It also applies to a wide range of conditions where fatigue is among the most debilitating aspects. Many neurological, autoimmune, musculoskeletal, respiratory, and various other condition types fall into this group. Fatigue and energy impairment are also associated with some forms of treatment, such as chemotherapy, and are widely reported by people who are neurodivergent and or live with mental distress. And of course, all these different types of conditions commonly co-occur. Next slide, please. So ELCs restrict mental as well as physical activity. Cognitive issues with processing speed and memory are especially under-recognized. Energy impairment is not just a feeling of tiredness that you can push through. It's when exertion causes what we call payback. This means there's a risk of harm attached, whether it's short-term worsening or long-term deterioration and relapse. ELCs are typically fluctuating conditions, and this can make it harder to capture support needs. They may cause many other symptoms alongside fatigue, such as pain. They often take years to diagnose, and when they are, the diagnoses may be stigmatized or contested. All of this makes it harder for people with ELC to embrace a disabled identity and to get the adjustments and support that we need. That's why this research and guidance is so important, and I've been really excited to watch Bethan, Alison, and Anna's work unfold. Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine. Okay, so by way of context then, the research that's informed the guidance we're launching today took place in a higher education context in which there's been an increase in the number of academics who are declaring a disability, yet also persistent barriers to disclosure, which mean that the counts we have are currently almost certainly undercounts. Secondly, continued barriers to success and leaky pipelines that mean there are lower proportions of disabled staff at higher levels within academia. Thirdly, limited action on disability inclusion as part of EDI initiatives, with the REF Equality and Diversity Panel noting a paucity of action on disability in all but the best environment statements. Fourthly, an ongoing increase in the number of people with energy limiting conditions as a result of long COVID. Fifth, limited understanding of ELC amongst employers and limited guidance for employees with ELC on appropriate adjustments. In fact, 62% of our survey respondents said that they hadn't asked for reasonable adjustments because they don't know what to ask for. So we're hoping this guidance will go some way to helping address that need. And finally, high levels of stress and burnout amongst higher education employees more generally. And we hope some of the recommended systemic changes that we're making today will help reduce this more broadly. But it is worth noting that this research was done prior to the current waves of redundancies in UK higher education, which are bringing with them increased precarity and increased workload for those who remain. So those levels of stress and burnout, along with ableism, are likely even higher now than they were when we did this research. So the guidance that we're launching today is based on research that included 239 survey respondents, 22 one-to-one interviews, 2 focus groups and policy review. Participants in this research were drawn from all regions of the UK, all subject areas, all HE sectors, including HE and FE, and from a broad range of contract types and career stages. We also included people who previously worked in higher education in academic roles in the UK, but who'd subsequently left those roles in order to try and capture the experiences of those who are lost due to that leaky pipeline. It's also worth noting that rather than just focusing on employers, this research specifically set out to explore experiences of the whole academic system, including, for example, people's experiences of interactions with funders, publishers, professional bodies, amongst many others. And that underpins the different sets of guidance that we're making available today. Okay, so to move on to some of the key findings from the research that have informed our guidance. Our research has worryingly shown stark inequalities of opportunity and the loss altogether of people from academic roles because of cultures which exclude people with ELC and failures to make adjustments for disabled staff. For example, 86% of survey respondents said that an ELC had a significant or very significant negative effect on their everyday working life. 84% said they'd turned down external roles that could contribute to career progression because of having an ELC. 79% said that an ELC had significantly or very significantly negatively affected their career progression. And only 25% said that the culture at their workplace is inclusive of people with energy limiting conditions. And of those who'd asked for reasonable adjustments, only 46% said that all of their requested reasonable adjustments had been implemented. It's also important to note that 56% of survey respondents said that the challenges they faced due to having an ELC were compounded by intersecting forms of oppression. And looking through the free text answers that gave more detail on this is a pretty damning reflection on the sector overall in terms of equality and diversity. So answers there included reference to sexism, classism, racism, xenophobia, homophobia, transphobia, fatphobia, ageism, ableism related to both ELC and other disabilities, discrimination against neurodivergent people, people with mental health conditions, and people from the global south, and related to religion, pregnancy, menopause, and caring responsibilities as well. So there's clearly still a lot of work on EDI that's needed within the sector. What's evident then is that there's a broken career ladder for academics with energy limiting conditions along with others. This doesn't need to be the case. So as one participant told us, with better support, I could have done so much more. So to look in a bit more detail at a few aspects of academic cultures that act as barriers to success and inclusion for people with energy limiting conditions. And the report and recommendations we're launching today cover far more than what we're covering in the presentation. So just to pick on a few. So first, precarious and casualised employment is rife within the sector, and this makes it particularly difficult to manage academic employment for someone with an ELC. The need to work on the project that someone's employed on, whilst also working on their own publications and writing multiple job applications, is challenging for anyone, but more so if you have limited energy to begin with. Having to move job frequently, especially when accompanied by a geographic move, also means losing access and having to re-establish medical and social support. On top of that, the scarcity of permanent research-only contracts means that for those academics with ELC whose disability would preclude them from teaching, but who can do research, particularly remote research, there are even fewer permanent contracts to apply for. And likewise, the scarcity of permanent part-time contracts also excludes those who need to work part-time. Cultures of overwork were, perhaps unsurprisingly, also mentioned repeatedly. These are produced through both formal and informal actions, including the proliferation of unmanageable workloads, boasting about overwork, criteria for securing a job or passing probation or being promoted, which requires overwork, cultures in which those who have adjusted workloads or need time off sick are made to feel guilty because of the lack of capacity amongst colleagues who already have unmanageable workloads themselves, and multiple short, inflexible and competing deadlines often being an issue. In addition to this, cultures of socialization and networking outside of work hours are also exclusionary. Participants reported being left out of grant teams despite them having the most relevant expertise, and feeling that their colleagues see them as not as committed as they are because they don't socialise after hours. They suggested that lunch or other networking activity within hours would be more inclusive. In addition to a lack of inclusion for people with ELC, these cultures also pose health and safety risks. So as Catherine mentioned, one of the core elements of ELC is that pushing through exhaustion can cause serious health deterioration. Concerningly, 94% of our survey respondents said that their work is either never or only sometimes manageable without exacerbating their symptoms. 57% of those who'd left academic roles said that their health improved after leaving, and 93% of survey respondents said they make sacrifices in their personal life to have sufficient energy for work. On this last note, it's important to clarify that these sacrifices aren't just not being able to socialise with friends or spend time with family, although those are really important for well-being. For some participants, these sacrifices are being unable to perform personal well-being tasks like having showers or cooking. And in order to work, some participants are bedbound most weekends. These are serious health and safety implications. As I mentioned earlier, cultures of overwork and unmanageable workloads are problems for many academics. But compounding this for academics with energy limiting conditions is a failure by managers to recognise the additional time it takes to do tasks when you're living with an energy impairment. 89% of our survey respondents said that the tasks they do in their job take longer because of their energy limiting condition. This might include, for example, taking longer to read an essay or a paper, to navigate an online system, to process information, or to walk across campus to get to teaching or meetings. Despite this, only 7% of respondents said that their workload was adjusted accordingly, and only 2% said that this adjustment was recorded as extra time in the workload model. This matters because when workload models are made transparent, if workload adjustments aren't recorded as extra time, this can result in animosity from colleagues, guilt for the person with energy limiting conditions, or force that person to disclose their condition to colleagues in fear of being seen that they're not pulling their weight. As one participant said, I'm expected to have the same workload as my colleagues, therefore I need to work longer hours to accomplish similar tasks. Importantly, many participants on teaching and research contracts said that the additional time it took them to do teaching, marking, and administrative work meant that there was no or little time left for research. And given the importance of research to probation and promotion criteria, this left them unable to progress in their careers. Inaccessible campus infrastructures and spaces that also exclude academics with energy limiting conditions. Many reported systems that don't account for disability, with timetabling systems, scheduling teaching in locations that are inaccessible, or being given inadequate time to get between teaching locations, with no opportunity for a break, to use the bathroom, or to get something to eat or drink. The increasing use of open plan offices also exclude those with energy limiting conditions and seriously impact the health of anyone with sensory sensitivities. As one participant said, they wanted everybody to be in an open plan office. It was loud, the light was too bright, it was freezing cold and impossible to concentrate. It worked for almost nobody. Many participants also talked about a recent rollback in remote working that had previously improved accessibility for them. And this has often been accompanied by the removal of infection controls and increased presenteeism in the sense of expectations that people will work when they're sick and valuing on-campus presence over remote work. And these also have health implications for anyone with a suppressed immune system or infection-triggered chronic illness. As well as health risks, all of these things make it much more difficult for people with ELC to be successful in their jobs. One participant, for example, forced to work in an open plan office, reported working evenings once they got home to make up for the wasted time during the day when they were in an office where they couldn't concentrate on their work. Okay, so our findings paint a pretty poor picture in terms of existing inclusion of people with ELC in academic workplaces. But it's also important to say that ELC inclusive workplaces are possible. We also heard from people whose workplaces had made systemic changes to be more inclusive or who had reasonable adjustments which not only allowed them to survive but also importantly to thrive in their work. So this infographic produced by the brilliant Stacey Bias, as are the other illustrations we're using today, this summarizes, for example, the big impact that small changes like allowing remote and flexible working can have. So in the top panel, we see someone with an energy limiting condition having to use energy to commute to work, to stand and lecture in person, to try and get through a workload which doesn't account for the extra time it takes them to do things, having no time left for research, so losing out on promotion, spending more energy commuting home, and then having to be in bed all evening while they miss out on being able to do household chores, see friends, or spend time with family. In the second panel, we see someone with reasonable adjustments who is able to spend the time and energy they would have spent commuting at either end of the day, writing a grant proposal or reading a paper, whilst lying on the sofa in order to save energy and reduce pain. They can take part in student meetings online, sitting down, and with a more balanced workload, have time left for research and are therefore able to be successful in promotion. So whilst having an ELC means they're unlikely to be able to do a lot of things still outside work, this does at least give them some more options in terms of perhaps doing some household chores or seeing some friends or spending some time with family. So how do we realise these more inclusive workplaces? The two guidance documents we're launching today contain information about the research and key findings, then have different sections for different groups who we hope can help implement the recommendations. So we thought of this akin to a kind of choose your own adventure book, where you choose which pages you go to depending on what your role is. So there are sections for academics with energy limiting conditions themselves, which includes advice on how to talk to, who to talk to, and how to work out what adjustments to ask for. Advice for people with responsibility for managing work conditions, so line managers or HR leads. And this includes information on how to support disclosure, such as emphasising that the Equality Act definition of disability does include fluctuating conditions and conditions that involve fatigue. It includes why we're creating more inclusive workplaces in the first place, so in terms of equality legislation, health and safety, and also REF environment considerations. There's a section for EDI leads and union representatives, which also covers how to support disclosure and then how to make a case for ELC inclusive workplaces, but also suggestions about where to take care with things like campaigns to call for workload transparency. There's then a long list of recommended adjustments, both including individual adjustments and systemic changes, including dedicated sections for publishers and editors and for conference organisers. And in that section for conference organisers, we're specifically looking at things to aid people with ELC because there's a wealth of other conference guidance available out there more generally in terms of accessibility. And we then have a separate document for research funders, which includes guidance on improving inclusion for academics with ELC, both as grant applicants and as reviewers and panel members. Each of these sections has quite a detailed list of adjustments, all of which have been mentioned by participants and which have been considered reasonable somewhere. We don't have time to talk through all of them now, but we're going to highlight a few key recommendations. First, though, all of our recommendations are underpinned by the following principles. First, that institutions need to value academics with ELC. ELC may affect speed and quantity of work, but not quality. Under the right conditions, people with ELC can thrive, can become leaders in research, teaching, and administrative work, and bring original and important perspectives to these roles. Inaccessible workplaces means that academia loses out on the important work of people with ELC. And in many cases, the expectations of volume of work for promotion, for example, far exceed things like ref expectations in terms of number of outputs or publications. And slower and more careful forms of scholarship are vital and valuable. We asked all participants what change they would like to see in order to make academia more inclusive. Again and again, people told us that less competition and more collaboration is what's needed. Often the only way that employers recognise and show they value people is through awards, which force colleagues to compete against each other. Alternative ways of valuing the different things that all people bring to an institution is needed. Secondly, flexibility in terms of location and time of work are key. Every individual with ELC is different. Some may work better in the morning, some in the afternoon, and having the flexibility to schedule activities according to their individual symptom patterns are important. In fact, flexibility was one aspect of academic work that came up again and again when we asked participants if there were elements of academic work that were compatible with having an ELC. Though it's also worth noting that, as I mentioned earlier, rollbacks in flexibility over the last few years are increasingly making academic work less accessible for many people. Thirdly, workload and pacing are vital. So pacing or managing energy so there aren't peaks and troughs of activity is central to managing an energy limiting condition in order to avoid relapse. To enable this, it's vital that the additional time it takes for people with ELC to do tasks is factored into workload. Setting realistic deadlines for things and avoiding deadline bunching can also help reduce burnout for all academic staff. Finally, cultures of trust. People with ELC are best positioned to know what works for them. Trust them to do so, only seeking advice from occupational health doctors when a medical opinion is really necessary. So I'm now going to hand over to Alison, who's going to talk through a small portion of the many recommendations that are in the guidance. Thanks, Alison.
Thanks, Bethan. So unsurprisingly, given our findings, a core set of recommendations concern workload and pace. We set out in the document several ways in which additional time taken to complete tasks can be factored into the workload models. In addition to this, work missed due to disability or sick leave needs to be reallocated, not rescheduled. Participants spoke of having to catch up on teaching or marking when returning from sick leave and contributing to the further relapse and further sick leave. Other recommendations included short deadlines and deadline bunching, and this was particularly important during marking periods, along with rest days after intense activity, amongst many other recommendations. Next slide, please. There are systemic changes needed in terms of contract types. In particular, fewer casualised contracts along with more permanent research only or permanent part-time posts are needed. Some people also told us examples of good practice in relation to career progression expectations. These included emphasising quality of work rather than quantity, acknowledging that international travel and taking on additional roles outside the university may not always be possible, giving equal recognition to online as well as offline conference attendance, extending deadlines for promotion and probation applications, and recognising that until research funding is made more accessible, grant capture may be lower. And again, this was amongst other examples given. Right. In relation to home-based working and flexible working, this was also key. This allows people to manage their own time and location of work according to energy availability and fluctuating symptoms. In order to make workplaces as inclusive as possible, this was best when staff were allowed the flexibility to choose whether to work at home or on campus, except when for particular tasks such as lab work, which obviously requires campus facilities. This not only meant that academics with ELC do not need to ask for reasonable adjustments, as this flexibility is already there, thus reducing segregation of disabled and non-disabled staff, avoiding arbitrary on-campus mandates and ensuring all meetings and training are available in hybrid form also facilitates this flexibility. Encouraging staff and students who are ill to take sick leave and can work from home if they're able to. This also helps prevent infection transmission. It's particularly important for those with ELC who are immune suppressed or may have an infection-triggered condition. One example of good practice that was given to us was by a participant who was able to teach from home via a video link, but there was a teaching assistant present in the classroom to help the students if needed. Next slide. Other recommendations we made concern adjustments to workspaces, timetabling, transport to and from campus, all to make it more accessible. Timetabling teaching close to offices and in accessible rooms may seem something that's fairly obvious, but this is something that many people don't have. Another recommendation was around making parking spaces accessible throughout the course of the day. On many university campuses, as you will know, it's a first come, first served basis, and that there's inadequate parking provision. That means that people have to get on campus very early in the morning, otherwise they won't get parked. For many people with ELC, the walking and standing involved in public transport is simply not feasible, and therefore inadequate parking provision means that they're not able, that they make themselves ill trying to get to work early enough to get a parking space, but it also means that adjustments such as flexible working hours or time-shifted days in reality can't be realised. In absence of designated personal parking spaces, some universities have enabled this through allowing people with ELCs who may not be eligible for a blue badge a permit to allow them to use disabled bays. However, this needs to occur alongside an increase in the number of disabled parking bays to ensure that this isn't taking up space for those who do have a blue badge. Other changes concern avoiding open plan offices, ensuring infrastructure like lifts are well maintained, and providing HEPA filters in shared spaces. To rectify the isolation many people with ELC feel, allowing space and time for networking during working hours and in hybrid form is also important. Again, there are many more recommendations in our paper. There are also sections in this guidance providing recommendations on admin support and coaching and suggestions of office furniture and computing equipment that may be helpful. Finally, for the main report, we have also included recommendations of things that people found useful to facilitate travel, such as additional nights accommodation, additional funding for first-class tickets, taxis, flexible booking systems which allow disabled academics to book outside of designated suppliers, and rest days before and after travel recorded as disability leave. In relation to conferences, the recommendations focused on ELC-specific adjustments, as there are plenty of guides to accessibility available for disability more generally. Specifically for people with ELC, the opportunity to attend, present and work and network online as well as offline is vital, along with allowing pre-recorded presentations, ensuring good infection control, opportunities for rest and providing quiet spaces when people can lie down. One thing that we want to particularly highlight here, and one which is often overlooked, is the need for networking opportunities outside of break times. So those who need to use their breaks simply to rest don't miss out on meeting other people. In addition to this, seating is often inadequate in break and networking spaces, and this needs to be addressed. As one respondent explained, Conferences always have to stand up networking drinks, coffee breaks, even meals. They are totally inaccessible to me, but what can I do? In terms of publishers, recommendations for publishers reiterate the need for reasonable and flexible turnarounds for reviews, responses to reviews, and proofs. People told us that these are often very short, a matter of a couple of days or less, with no flexibility, and that they often fall on weekends or holidays. There was a need to be negotiable for older people with ELCs, taking into account other workload and pro rata for academics on part-time contracts. The provision of audio vision books or articles may also be helpful for those who reading takes significantly longer. Thank you. I'll hand you back to Bethan. Thank you.
Thanks, Alison. Just trying to advance the slide. There we go. Okay, so to finish with, I'm going to just outline some of the recommendations in the separate guidance that's specifically for funders. Before doing so, I just want to acknowledge that this work was led by Anna Ruddock, who unfortunately can't be here today. It's worth also saying that these recommendations can be used by universities as well in relation to internal funding schemes. So firstly, we acknowledge that funders have been improving EDI initiatives recently, but there are further adjustments that are needed to include people with ELC. So as with the core principles for the other guidance, valuing academics with ELC, listening to and working with people with ELC, co-creating systemic change is core to all of our recommendations. So we suggest the need for anti-ableist funding schemes that are clear with applicants up front about the support and adjustments that are available, and which clearly set out the processes in place to ensure that disabled researchers are not disadvantaged in the review and allocation process. One key recommendation is changing rules relating to career stage specific funding. So particularly for early career funding, where often this is restricted according to time since PhD completion. However, for people with ELC who may need extra time, people who've been stuck on repeated precarious contracts, people who've worked part-time, they often have little time to pursue their own research agendas during the early years post-PhD. Funders often have flexibility there in terms of taking into account career breaks, but this rarely takes into account slower working. We suggest here that better eligibility criteria for ECR funding might be based on the funding that someone's received to date rather than time from PhD completion. Again, flexibility is also important in terms of deadlines and offering additional funding to allow extra time for researchers whose pace may fluctuate during the course of a grant, or to support accessibility needs that may change during the course of a grant as well. In addition to this, some participants spoke of being reluctant to include accessibility costs or mention disability in grant applications, because they feared that it would be looked on negatively by reviewers. It's important for funders to challenge this, but also to be aware that the slower pace of work by some disabled people needs to be excluded from any assessments of value for money during grant panels. For people on grant panels and for interviews for people with ELC, providing hybrid access is also important, along with adjustments for those attending in person, similar to the conference adjustments that Alison outlined. As part of this anti-ableist funding scheme design, we also recommend that funders make available seed funding to support collaborative proposal development with disabled research partners to ensure that this isn't requiring unpaid labour from disabled people. Funders also have the potential to ensure that researchers they fund are being given the time and adjustments they need to carry out their research. Here we suggest that funders need to be clear about the support that's expected by host institutions. So some academics with ELC reported that applying for grants costed on an FEC basis. So that's grants where a percentage of the person's time for the principal investigator or co-investigators are costed into the grant, rather than a post provided to buy someone out of teaching or other responsibilities. People reported that that kind of costing, the FEC costing, wasn't accessible for them because FEC funding doesn't result in their workload being freed up in order for them to work on the grant. Instead, there's often an expectation that they would work on the grant on top of their already existing full workload. This would be impossible for many people, but particularly those with ELC. And we suggest that institutions should be audited by funders to ensure that people are being allowed the time that's being costed into the grant. On a related note, allowing a higher maximum per grant for researchers who need additional time would also be useful for FEC grants, where that additional time very quickly takes you outside of the envelope of the maximum grant time. In short, funders have the potential to be allies to disabled academics here, and this potential was evident from one participant who told us that their researcher had been their funder had been absolutely amazing, even taking on their institution for not making adjustments. Finally, I want to return to the importance of valuing academics with energy limiting conditions. We also asked people what having an energy limiting condition had meant in terms of their work in a positive way. People talked about how their condition had given them new and original insights into their research and teaching, gave them lived experience that allowed them to better empathise with diverse students and research partners. Having to find workarounds and innovative ways of doing things, people told us had been beneficial then for their wider teams. And I guess the note we want to end on then is that with inclusive workplaces, academics with ELC can perform at the highest levels, benefiting their colleagues and the universities they work for. Okay, so that's enough of us talking. What we're going to do now is just open up for some questions. So if you haven't already typed any questions in the chat, please do so. And I'm going to ask Poppy to let us know if there are any already there.
So before I share some questions, I just want to mention that there's been a lot of comments about how brilliant, important and affirming this research and webinar has been. So well done and thank you all for sharing so far. The first few questions are more administrative, but I feel like they're important for people to know the answers. And that's whether slides will be shared after the webinar in addition to the video. People would like a reminder about where they can find and download the guidance documents, and also more broadly how they can best support the implementation of these recommendations through their work and their institutions.
Brilliant, thank you, Poppy, and thank you everyone for those positive comments and for that question. So what I'll do is just flick onto the last slide here. That QR code or the link down here should take you to the project web page where the guidance is available to download as PDFs, both of those documents. We will be uploading the video there. It may just take us a few days to get it sorted and to get the captions edited. Also, yes, we can upload the presentation, the slides as well, to the website as well. Again, it might just not be immediately, but will be over the next few days. So hopefully you'll be able to access there. In terms of how to support this, any opportunity to share, to try and implement some of these things, to, you know, we're looking also to maybe develop some workshops from this as well. So if you work in an organisation that would find it useful to have us come and talk to your organisation, do some workshops around this, please get in touch. One thing that we've done on the website where you can download the PDFs is we've also just got a link to a very short form just asking you for some feedback. This is, as I'm sure most of you who work in academia can appreciate, we're hoping to be able to to document any impact from this. So if you do find it useful and do use it, even if that's just in making you feel better or giving you the confidence to ask for an adjustment, please do let us know, because that lets us feedback then to the people who've given us impact funding around this. But yes, any opportunity for anyone to share, to try and implement. If you want us to come and talk, obviously we have limited energy, but within the kind of confines of what energy we have available, we're hoping to be able to do that.
Thank you. This question links to implementation in practice. So somebody asked, somebody said that the landscape is increasingly pressured with higher workload for all. How can I reduce the workload of those with energy limiting conditions when there isn't that give in the system? So it means someone else has to go above their workload to pick that up.
Yeah, thank you. This is a really difficult question to answer, I think, and it is a really difficult situation that people are in. I'll maybe start with the negative, that this is going to be challenging, and particularly given all the redundancies that are happening at the moment. Already, when we did this research, a lot of people said that their workload had increased over the last 3 years. I can't imagine that hasn't been exacerbated over the last 2 years as well. Certainly my own workload has massively increased. There are some things I think that can be done in order to try and manage workloads more broadly. So some of the things, like I was saying, those criteria for things like promotion, probation, all of that are often much, much higher than what is expected by, for example, the REF. So there are things that institutions are requiring that's placing additional workload. Ways of kind of reducing workload through things like allowing hybrid access that doesn't use energy to have to travel across campus, are ways of trying to reduce workload, trying to reduce meetings and the length of meetings, things like that. It is really difficult, and it came up again and again that people feel guilty because they're working in small teams, and if they're not doing that work, someone else is having to do it. And I think there is, there's a much wider issue here that certainly the union is concerned with, about unmanageable workloads for everybody. So there is going to need to be cross-sector change. But it's also important, I think, for people with energy limiting conditions for whom work takes longer, also to acknowledge that that isn't a reduction in workload for them. It's recognizing that additional time. And I appreciate that if you're a manager, that doesn't create more give in the system, but it is about leveling the playing field there, that if that person with energy limiting conditions has the exact same workload as somebody without, they are already being asked to do more and to work more hours because it will take longer. So there's something that is about fairness here as well. And like I said, the wider sectoral change is also something that we need. And I don't know where that's going to come from at the moment, but hopefully from all sorts of areas, we can push for that change.
Thank you. So another common question on the chat, and one with lots of upvotes, is whether something similar is being done for others in academia. So those who work in higher education institutions but aren't necessarily academics. So people who work in professional services, or even doctoral researchers, which are kind of blur the boundaries a bit between student and staff.
Yeah. Just to say, Catherine or Alison, if you want to contribute to any answers on this, please do just wave at me so that it's not just me talking over you. Yeah, so we did include, within this research, we limited it just to academics, partly as a way of making the research manageable. We included PhD students who also teach. The reasons for doing that was because the ways in which reasonable adjustments are managed for students is often very different to the ways they're managed for staff, and particularly around things like funding, around the disabled students allowance, versus access to work, those kind of things. So that's the reason we kind of limited it here. If you're interested in kind of access issues for disabled students, have a look at Disabled Students UK webpage. They've, for the last couple of years, done the largest survey of disabled students in the UK, and their reports are really useful. It is something that I know people who work in doctoral training partnerships are pushing for with UKRI in terms of this question of extra time. So I know there is work going on there around students. For professional services, yes, we didn't include professional services in this work, although some of the people who'd left academic jobs had then moved into professional service roles. So some people in those roles were included. And those people did tend to say that those roles were more accessible. But I think particularly seeing what's happening now with the number of professional services people losing jobs as well as academics, and the ways things are being scaled up in professional services as well, I certainly think there's definitely a need for research that focuses on that as well. Catherine.
Thanks, Beth. I just want to jump in on the subject of students with energy limiting conditions, including PhD students. I'm aware that there's been some research done by, I think it's Pippa Hamilton, on energy limiting conditions and how to support students. So that's obviously ELCs is a new area, but I'm aware if if you're looking for something to cite, that might be a good place to start. And name's Pippa Hamilton. Sorry, I can't remember the exact title or anything.
That's brilliant. Thank you, Catherine. Alison.
Just to say, obviously this research was was around people, academics, but to me it's good practice, and if that could filter through and filter down and filter across, then hopefully everyone can benefit from it. I mean, obviously we do need research for specific groups beyond those who are working in as researchers or as lecturers or what have you, but to me it's broader than that. It is a guidance, it is good practice that benefits everybody, potentially, hopefully. Thank you.
Thanks, Alison. We've got 5 minutes left, so maybe if there's one more question, Poppy.
There's so many brilliant questions.
Okay, maybe two then, but we'll see how we go. Try and answer them quickly.
One around language choice, which I thought might be quite interesting for you to reply to, and it's got quite a lot of upvotes. But it's about the concept of ELC, energy limiting conditions. And this person said that it's clearly more useful and encompassing than CFS, chronic fatigue syndrome. But how far do you think it will be taken on, as I think CFS has only recently been more widely used and recognised?
Catherine, do you want to take this one?
Sure. Yes, as you say, ELC is much broader than CFS. So CFS is specific medical diagnosis. ELC covers any number of diagnoses and combinations of diagnoses. So it's not a medical term. It's more of an umbrella term that is more useful if, I think, I hear what you say about it's a new thing, not many people have heard of it. I think we all need to push for our higher education sector to recognise it and use it in the way that neurodiversity, maybe 10 years ago, everyone's like, oh, what's that? Now it's so much more, better understood, and it's so much more useful than many of the diagnoses that come under that umbrella, because it's about how something affects you. So your line manager or supervisor doesn't need to know every single aspect. Say if you have MS or rheumatoid arthritis, they don't need to know all your symptoms and have a confirmation of your diagnosis. They just need to know how it affects you. And we've outlined that it's fluctuating, it limits cognitive function. So if we can just get that concept kind of better understood, so many people who with a whole load of different diagnoses will benefit, and I think from better just having their impairment and their needs better understood. So I just urge everyone to use it and share it, and hopefully it will grow.
Just to add to that as well, I mean, often a lot of energy limiting conditions are very difficult to diagnose, as Catherine said earlier in the talk, and can take up to or over 10 years to get a firm diagnosis. Now, the Equality Act doesn't require a diagnosis, it's about impairment. So energy impairment and energy limiting conditions exists outside of individual diagnoses, and it provides a way to try and get recognition and get adjustments, even if you are struggling with an impairment but don't have a diagnosis label yet. So I think it's valuable for that as well. Is there one more, Poppy, and then yeah, we'll wrap up.
Yes. So this one got quite a lot of upvotes, so I think it's a good one to ask, is around, do you have any advice for academics with ELCs on communicating with students about why you may need to meet online rather than in person? This person said, after the lockdowns, I find some students are now quite resistant to doing things remotely.
That's a good question. I think probably being open with students, but again, I think it may be a situation of talking to line managers about this. I would imagine there are students as well who would prefer to meet online or may find it more accessible to meet online. So if it's things like tutorials, it may be about asking for allocations of students to be made around access needs as well. Offering an option of online or offline if you're able to do that. But if it's not accessible for you to meet students in person, then I think that needs to be a conversation with the line manager, and that needs to be clearly communicated to students that those opportunities are going to be online. I agree with you. I think there's been some pushback since COVID. And I'm getting the sense that that pushback is easing a little bit as students are coming through now who didn't have their education disrupted quite as much. But I suspect this is going to be an issue ongoing. And I think, yeah, again, it's conversation with line managers, module leads. Again, maybe there's an option to give students, you know, if you want to come to these tutorials in person, then you do it this time. If not, if you want to do online ones, you come at this time, and give students the choice to opt for which one is most accessible to them. But obviously it will depend on the context that you're in. Alison.
Yeah, I mean, obviously I agree with everything Bethan said, but also I think it's coming back to this, the usefulness of energy impairment as a concept, because it's giving that student the information that perhaps they need, or perhaps you feel okay with sharing, without having to go into medical labels, diagnostics, treatment, tablets, whatever your own lived experience is from a medical perspective. It's actually just giving them the information that they need to perhaps understand why online may be the only option for you at this point in time. But obviously, as Bethan says, you know, it's back to talking to your line manager, and also what you're comfortable with disclosing as well is paramount. Thank you.
Thanks, Alison. And thank you, Poppy, for corralling the questions so well. Okay, so just before we finish today, we've run over by a couple of minutes, apologies. As I said, we're hoping to develop workshops, so get in touch if you're interested in that. I also want to thank everyone who attended today. We've been overwhelmed by the number of people that signed up. It was rather terrifying, to be honest, but also really nice to think that there's this community of people out there who are interested in this. Also, thanks from me to Alison, Catherine and Anna for work on the project. Our brilliant advisory board, which included people from Chronic Illness Inclusion, UCU Disabled Members Committee, and the National Association of Disabled Staff Network. Thanks to Stacey Byers for the illustrations as well. We sincerely hope this guidance is helpful. If it is, please let us know. If you think we've missed something, please also let us know. So obviously these documents are kind of finalised at the moment, but what we're keen to do is have an evolving list of adjustments on the website, because as academic work evolves, so too will the adjustments that are needed. So if you have had something that's helped you that isn't in our guidance, please do email us and let us know, and we can then start to collate a kind of live evolving list on the website that we can add to once we've got a few of those. And also, again, just to mention that we've Poppy's put the Padlet link into the chat, and please do use the Padlet over the next couple of weeks to post any reflections on this webinar today or on the guidance once you've had a chance to have a read of it. But thank you very much, everyone.